I drove from Charleston to Columbus with my heart pounding like a bell inside my chest. In the passenger seat, covered with a wool blanket, rested the wooden chest that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside, it held maps and mementos that for years had been the invisible thread binding our family together. As I traveled along the interstate, I thought about Everett's face when he saw them, how his eyes would light up like when he was a child, tracing the hand-drawn lines with his fingers. I kept telling myself that a baby shower was the perfect moment to pass on that legacy. When I finally parked in front of his house, the sky was filling with low clouds, and the air in the Midwest had that sharp edge that takes your breath away. I rang the doorbell with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. It was Sierra who opened the door. She was wearing an emerald green dress and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Before I could greet her, she said with a dry smile, the party was yesterday. Just family." I felt my legs go weak, with a lump in my throat. I asked what she meant, but she just shrugged. Then, as if to drive the point home, she turned her head slightly toward the living room. Through the crack, I could see an older woman sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by glasses and plates still uncleared. Sierra followed my gaze and added, with cutting casualness, "My real mother." She didn't say anything else. She stood in the doorway, blocking the way, and I understood she wasn't going to let me in. From inside came laughter and the clinking of toasts. My hands gripped the box as if it were holding me up. Shame burned on my face. But no one came out to greet me. Not Everett. Not a message. Not a word. I returned to the car. There I sat, with the chest in my lap, listening to the murmur of a celebration I'd never been invited to. Outside, the wind shook the branches. And inside me, a silence was beginning to form that would soon transform into something else. Into a decision that would accompany me to the next stop on my journey. The road led me to a small motel on the outskirts. With a neon sign that flickered intermittently, I parked without hurry, as if every extended minute was a way to escape what had just happened in Columbus. In the room, barely lit by a wobbly lamp, I placed the box on the bed. My hands took a few seconds to decide to open it, as if the wood held not just memories, but also an answer I feared hearing. When I lifted the lid, there appeared what I had cared for so many times as if it were a treasure. 3 hand-drawn maps by my grandfather in the aftermath of the war. He had traced secret trails of traders in the Appalachian Mountains, paths that allowed our family to survive in times of hardship. The folds of the yellowish paper still held the scent of wax and old ink. I ran my fingers over those crooked lines and felt the vibration of a memory that refused to die. I remembered Everett as a child. He would sit on my lap and ask me again and again to tell him the same stories where the river forked, where his great-grandfather had set up camp, where the cotton fields grew before the war. His little fingers followed the paths as if they were living rivers, and I thought that, when the time came, he would be the natural guardian of this inheritance. Now those hands that once trembled with curiosity asked for nothing, not even a call. The box I was supposed to give him had become a bundle of silence, more a burden than a gift. I lay down on the bed and understood the absurdity of the trip, 9 hours there and 9 back to find a closed door. However, as I looked at the maps spread out before me, I began to sense that this wasn't an end. Maybe they were no longer just memories. Maybe those papers were something more, pieces of power, capable of changing what had until then seemed unchangeable. The return to Atlanta was heavier than the drive up. It wasn't the hours on the road or the fatigue built up in my back, but the certainty that something had broken beyond repair. When I got home, I left the box of maps on the sideboard and forced myself to make a coffee. as if the ritual could bring back some normalcy. But the silence enveloped me with an unbearable density. I opened the old cabinet where I kept the photo albums. I searched through yellowed pages until I found a recent image, taken at the New York Botanical Garden. In it were Everett, Sierra, and me, smiling under a magnolia tree. I remembered that day perfectly. A mild sun, a leisurely walk, the naive illusion of believing there was still room for me in their new life. However, as I looked at the photo calmly, the air caught in my throat. The image had been cut with precision. The half where my body appeared had vanished, as if I'd never been there. Everett and Sierra remained intact, embracing, smiling, while I'd been erased from the frame with a cruel, premeditated snip. It wasn't an oversight, not a bad cut. It was a silent declaration, the confirmation that my absence wasn't accidental, but a chosen act. I felt a stab of anger, but also a deeper chill, the one of understanding that to my own son. I was now dispensable. Everett's silence was more deafening than any shout. There were no insults, no direct reproaches, just that calculated void, that slow erasure that hurt more than any words. I put the photo back in the same place, but it was no longer a memory. It had become evidence, proof that the past I was trying to preserve existed only in my hands. I closed the album firmly and looked back at the box of maps, aware that sooner or later I'd have to open it again to discover what role they would play in what was to come. A week later, the mail carrier left a white envelope with gold lettering in my mailbox. When I opened it, I discovered the invitation to Everett and Sierra's wedding in Charleston. I read slowly, as if my eyes needed to confirm it. Ceremony only, no reception. It was an elegant way of telling me there would be no seat for me at the table, that my presence was only allowed on the periphery, under the solemnity of a rite where I now arrived as a stranger. I sat in the kitchen with the paper between my fingers, feeling a humiliation that, surprisingly, brought with it a new clarity. That polished, measured gesture left me bare before a truth I'd been denying for a long time. I was no longer part of their life, except when my silence suited them. I decided then to open the drawer where I kept documents and letters. The order of the folders contrasted with the disorder inside me. I pulled out first the receipts for 2 loans, $10,000 and $20,000 that I'd given to Everett for his first real estate ventures. I remembered well how he assured me they'd be repaid soon, that it was just an initial push. Years passed, and neither the money nor the gratitude returned. I kept digging through folders until I found a thicker document. It was the deed transfer for a cabin in the Rocky Mountains. Harlan and I had transferred it to Everett 5 years ago, convinced he'd care for it and keep it in the family. We signed with the hope of giving him a future, that this corner of stone and wood would remain a refuge for generations to come. But as I held that paper in my hands, a premonition ran through me like a shiver. Something didn't add up. The lack of news about the cabin, Everett's silence every time I asked, the way he dodged the topic. Everything told me that refuge might have already slipped from our hands without my knowledge. I placed the documents on the table, with my heart constricted, knowing that very soon I'd need to look deeper to discover what my son had done with that legacy. I opened the file cabinet again with a weight in my chest that oppressed me more than the fatigue accumulated in my bones. I flipped through page after page of deeds, contracts, and notarized letters until, among a stack of copies, what I feared appeared. There it was, a sales document signed 2 years ago. The cabin in the Rocky Mountains, the same one Harlan and I had entrusted to Everett, now listed under a third party's name. The price was exact, the notary's seal legitimate, but the signature next to my son's wasn't mine. I examined it closely. comparing it to my own signature on other papers. It had crooked curves, forced strokes, imitating the pulse of my hand without success. In that instant, I recognized the magnitude of the betrayal. It wasn't a simple oversight. Not a family rift, it was a forgery, a cold, calculated theft, executed with the certainty that I'd never discover it. The ground seemed to shift under my feet. I sat down abruptly, with the document clutched between my fingers, feeling that a lifetime of trust had cracked silently. I remembered the first time Everett ran through the meadows of that cabin, barely 7 years old, shouting that the place would always be his, and it was. But not in the way we'd imagined. He'd turned it into bargaining currency, used as collateral for a business whose existence I didn't know. Tears fought to come out, but I didn't allow them. I refused to let the forgery strip me of my dignity too. I breathed deeply, folded the document carefully, and filed it in a separate folder. I didn't know yet how or when, but I understood that the time had come to stop staying silent. The betrayal was no longer abstract or emotional. It had stamped paper, false signatures, and a notary's seal. And I, more than ever, needed to find a way to confront what I'd discovered, even if it cost me to recognize that my own son was the architect of that lie. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Among linen handkerchiefs and yellowed letters, I found a sealed envelope with my name handwritten on it. I recognized Harlan's handwriting instantly. My heart skipped a beat. His letters had the power to bring back his voice. Even though he was gone, I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the pages. The date was from just weeks before the illness defeated him. I began to read slowly, as if each word could resurrect him for a moment. He spoke to me with the serenity of someone who knows time is running out. He asked me not to close my eyes to the obvious, that Everett, in his eagerness to prove he could do more, risked being blinded by ambition. Our son loves you, but he can confuse success with possession, he wrote, further on. The ink hardened into firm strokes. The true legacy isn't the walls or the acres, Rosalind. It's dignity. Protect it even if you're left alone. Even if they accuse you of being selfish, what we built together is worth more than any signature on paper. As I read that sentence, the tears I'd held back earlier flowed without permission. It wasn't a cry of defeat, but of recognition. Harlan was speaking from the past to sustain me in the present. He'd seen what I refused to accept and left me a compass for when I got lost. I folded the letter and leaned it against the folder where I kept the proof of the forgery. I felt I was no longer alone in this fight. His hand still guided mine. His voice urged me to resist and not surrender what little remained intact. That letter wasn't just consolation. It was a moral map. If my grandfather's maps traced mountain paths, this one traced the trail to cross the storm ahead. I inhaled deeply, stored the envelope with the documents, and promised myself I wouldn't stop. The next day, I'd seek someone capable of turning my indignation into a real strategy. The next morning, I took a train to Denver with the folder of documents held tightly against my chest. During the trip, I reviewed every detail over and over: the forged signature, the sales deed, Harlan's letter, everything mixed with a knot of rage and a determination I could no longer contain. Upon arriving, I sought the office of Kendra Voss, a lawyer recommended for her experience in irregular inheritances. The building was understated, with stone walls and tall windows. I climbed the stairs and, entering her office, was greeted by a woman with a serene gaze and a confident expression. She didn't need much explanation. It was enough to hand her the papers for her to grasp the gravity. Kendra read in silence, turning the pages with a calm that contrasted with the tension in my hands. When she finished, she looked up and told me firmly that there was sufficient basis to file a complaint for patrimonial fraud. They haven't just manipulated documents, they've also used the property as collateral without your consent. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's a crime, she affirmed. I felt that finally someone was putting into words what I'd been screaming inside. The weight on my shoulders lightened just a bit, enough to let me breathe, before ending the meeting. Kendra leaned toward me and, in a more intimate tone, confessed something I hadn't expected years ago. Her own brother had taken a plot of land in Wyoming from her, taking advantage of her trust and her prolonged absence abroad. When I read your case, I remembered mine. I'm not just going to defend you as a lawyer. I'll do it also as a woman who knows what it means for your own blood to deny you what's yours. We sat in silence. But it was no longer the heavy silence of humiliation, but one that built a bridge, for the first time in a long while. I felt I wasn't fighting alone as I left the office. The folder no longer seemed like a burden, but a legitimate weapon, and in my mind, the idea of an inevitable confrontation with Everett and Sierra began to take shape. I accepted the invitation to dinner at their house with a calm that surprised even me. It wasn't naivety, it was preparation. I carried in my purse the folder that Kendra had organized with the initial legal report's clear proofs of the sale, the fraudulent collateral, and the forgery. Everett and Sierra greeted me with tense smiles. As if the air was filled with an invisible dust, we all pretended not to breathe. The table was well set, steaming dishes and wine glasses waiting to be raised, but my appetite was elsewhere. We talked about trivialities, the weather, jobs, upcoming vacations until I knew the moment had arrived. I took out the folder, placed it in front of me, and, looking them straight in the eyes, said in a firm voice, "I've read everything. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was forgery." The silence that followed was so dense that the ticking of the clock became unbearable. Everett shifted in his chair, avoided my gaze, and played with his fork as if the words could be erased if he didn't acknowledge them. It was Sierra who hurried to speak. "Rosalind, don't misunderstand. It was for the good of the family. The investment needed guarantees, and the cabin was there, unused. Everett did it thinking of everyone." I felt a chill run through me, but I replied without raising my voice, "You don't protect blood with lies." Sierra shrank back, as if she hadn't expected such a clear response. Everett finally looked up, but in his eyes there was no apology, only surprise. He stayed mute, trapped between shame and fear. I stood up calmly, gathered the folder, and put it back in my purse. I'd said what I needed to say, and they'd heard what they didn't want to hear. The table was still set, but dinner was over for me. As I closed the door behind me, I felt that the confrontation was just beginning, and that the coming weeks would decide which way the scales tipped. The court notification arrived on a gray morning. With the court seal and the coldness of official words, the judge had granted precautionary measures. The cabin returned provisionally to my name. And moreover, Everett and Sierra had 60 days to vacate the house in Atlanta that they thought was so theirs. I read the document several times, as if the ink could fade at any moment. But no, there it was, for the first time in a long time. Justice was leaning my way. The following days, the house transformed into strange territory. Cardboard boxes appeared in the hallways, some half full, others forgotten in a corner. The noise of closets opening and closing mixed with a tense, almost hostile silence. No one spoke more than necessary, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, just averted glances and closed doors. I, on the other hand, began to breathe differently each passing day. I reclaimed a fragment of peace. I no longer waited for calls that never came or strained to maintain conversations that only wore me down. At night, I took out the maps from the box and spread them on the table. I looked at them as if they were windows to another time, as if the hand-drawn lines reminded me that there were still paths they hadn't managed to take from me. I watched Everett move through the house with the shadow of someone who knows the ground is slipping away under their feet. Sierra, meanwhile, seemed entrenched in a haughty silence, as if she still trusted that everything would resolve in their favor. I didn't judge them out loud. The judge had already spoken the first word, and the rest was in motion, while they packed pieces of a life built on lies. I began to imagine another kind of inheritance, one not measured in square feet or deeds, and though I didn't yet know how to shape it, I sensed that my true victory wouldn't end when the house was empty, but when I decided what to do with what was still in my hands. The deadline ended without drama. Everett and Sierra left one morning without goodbyes, without tears or hugs. I watched them close the door with a firm thud, and for the first time in months, the house fell silent. It wasn't a painful void, but a clean calm, as if the walls could finally breathe with me. A few days later, I traveled alone to the cabin. The road through the mountains reminded me of summers with Harlan, when we dreamed of leaving our son a refuge that spoke of roots and continuity. Upon arriving, I lit the fireplace and spread the maps on the wooden table. The lines drawn by my grandfather seemed alive under the firelight, witnesses to a legacy that had resisted betrayal and time. I didn't want to store them away again. That night, I decided to donate them to the Colorado Historical Society, with a clear condition that they be used to train older women in workshops on oral history and heritage. I didn't want the maps to remain mute in a drawer, but to transform into new voices, into paths that others could travel. With Kendra's help, I set up the Liberated Legacies Association, a space dedicated to protecting widows and older mothers from patrimonial abuses. It was slow work, step by step, but each meeting and each shared story confirmed that I wasn't alone. There were many like me, erased in silence, who deserved to reclaim their name and place. A year later, at the inauguration of the first map exhibition, a young student approached me with a notebook in hand. She looked at me shyly and said, "Thanks to you. I know that stories don't get erased, they just change hands." I smiled with a serenity that no longer wavered. I hadn't lost a son, I'd gained an army of symbolic heirs. And in that instant, I understood that my victory wasn't in preserving walls, but in having turned the wound into a shared legacy that no one could forge away.